Thank you. I am too short for the camera, so I'm standing on this little platform here, which is why I look like a giant. Thank you and good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to present our work, which I will be presenting on behalf of my collaborators listed here. I have nothing to disclose. As we all know, 50% of untreated HIV-infected infants will progress to AIDS and death by 2 years of age. Based on the results of the SHARE trial, there has been a shift towards recommendation of earlier initiation of ART in infants. Similarly, there has been a recent shift towards recommendation of earlier PI-based ART as opposed to NNRTI-based ART. This shift in recommendation has largely been based off of the P1060 trial results, which enrolled nevirapine-exposed and nevirapine-unexposed children less than 3 years of age and randomized them to receive either nevirapine or boosted lopinavir-based ART. They saw that in the nevirapine arm there was a higher risk for death and virologic failure. When they stratified their cohort by age less than 12 months and greater than 12 months, the benefit of the boosted lopinavir held the same. And additionally, they did not see a difference between the nevirapine-exposed and nevirapine-unexposed groups within each age strata. So why do we see a benefit of boosted lopinavir even in nevirapine-unexposed children? One thought is that resistance develops quickly in infants treated with nevirapine because of the low genetic barrier to resistance and the once-daily lead-in dosing. Another possibility is that infants are infected with NNRTI-resistant virus. In P1060, in their nevirapine-exposed arm group, they saw a 12% rate of baseline nevirapine resistance, which was associated with an increased risk of virologic failure, shown in the Kaplan-Meier curve on the right. Abrams and colleagues studied ART-naive children less than 2 years of age in Johannesburg, South Africa. In their cohort of PMTCT-unexposed children, they saw a prevalence rate of 24% for NNRTI resistance mutations at baseline. They hypothesized that this high rate of baseline NNRTI resistance was likely due to poor maternal recall of PMTCT and maternal postpartum ARV use and/or poor record keeping, and less likely due to transmitted resistant virus, mainly because surveillance studies in that same area in ART-naive adults demonstrated much lower rates of NNRTI resistance mutations. In Mali, Maiga and colleagues demonstrated that there is about an 8% baseline resistance rate among ART-naive adults. The objectives of our study were to determine the rate of virologic failure after 6 months of ART, to determine the rate of baseline resistance, and to determine the association of baseline resistance with 6-month virologic failure or death in a cohort of HIV-infected infants and children initiating first-line ART in Bamako, Mali. We conducted a prospective observational study from November 2010 to February 2013 and enrolled HIV-1 infected children less than 10 years of age initiating first-line ART. Country guidelines for when and what ART to start throughout the study period mirrored 2010 WHO guidelines. We conducted viral load testing at 6 months and genotypic resistance testing of stored baseline and 6-month samples at study end. Participants were seen monthly to assess for self-reported adherence, and logistic regression was performed to evaluate factors associated with baseline resistance and virologic failure defined as viral load greater than or equal to 1,000 copies per ml, or death defined as death occurring after 1 month of ART. We enrolled 150 ART-naive children less than 10 years of age. Of those 150 enrolled children, baseline resistance testing was available for 139. 19 children either died before the 1-month visit, were lost to follow-up, or were missing their 6-month sample, leaving 120 children, which we included in the final analysis. I will be presenting the results of those 120 children today. This table lists the participant characteristics for the 120 children enrolled in our study and included in the final analysis. Median age at enrollment was 2.6 years, with 40% of participants being female. The vast majority of participants reported no PMTCT exposure or postpartum maternal ARV use. The majority of children were breastfed or had been breastfed and were classified as WHO stage 3 or 4 at enrollment. Median CD4 count at enrollment was 683, and median viral load was around 700,000 copies per ml. 60% of infants and children were initiated on an NNRTI-based regimen, and 40% were initiated on a PI-based regimen. 27 or 23% of children harbored NNRTI-resistance associated mutations at baseline, the most common being K103N and Y181C. 11 harbored baseline NRTI resistance associated mutations, and no children had PI resistance associated mutations at baseline. There was no association between gender, WHO stage, breastfeeding status, PMTCT exposure, and maternal postpartum ARV with baseline NNRTI resistance. However, children with baseline NNRTI resistance were younger than those without. When we restricted to children who were greater than or equal to 36 months at enrollment, we found that 16% of those children harbored baseline NNRTI resistance mutations, and half of those went on to experience virologic failure. Of our 120 participants, 39 or 34% of children experienced virologic failure at 6 months, and 4 or 3% experienced death occurring after 1 month of ART. In unadjusted analyses, we found that adherence and baseline NNRTI resistance was associated with our primary endpoints of virologic failure and/or death. After adjusting for gender, age, adherence, initial ART regimen, and residence distance from clinic, we saw that baseline NNRTI resistance was associated with an 8-fold increased odds of developing virologic failure at 6 months or death after 1 month of ART, with a p-value of less than 0.001. Our studies had several limitations, including the fact that it was an observational study with only 6 months of follow-up. There was limited baseline viral load and CD4 data, so we were not able to include those variables in our final model. Because the timing of infection was unknown, and it's likely that the maternal or caregiver reporting of PMTCT and postpartum maternal ARV use was unreliable, we cannot make any conclusions about whether or not the baseline NNRTI resistance we saw was due to NNRTI exposure or transmitted resistant virus. The fact that there was an association between younger age and presence of baseline NNRTI resistance suggests that some of the resistance was due to unmeasured NNRTI exposure. And finally, caregiver reporting of adherence is not always accurate. In conclusion, we saw a high rate of baseline NNRTI resistance despite little to no reported prior ARV exposure. The rate of baseline NNRTI resistance that was seen in our study is higher than what's been seen in surveillance studies in the same area in adults, suggesting that there was some unmeasured NNRTI exposure. We also saw a high rate of virologic failure after 6 months of first-line ART, and baseline NNRTI resistance was associated with an 8-fold increased odds of 6-month virologic failure or death. When we restricted our analysis to children greater than or equal to 36 months, this odds increased to 23 and was still statistically significant. Based on 2013 WHO guidelines, 16% of children eligible for NNRTI-based ART had baseline NNRTI resistance. We believe our study results highlight the need for low-cost, easy-to-use resistance testing to help guide management of HIV-infected children in resource-limited countries. We also think that there is a need for long-term follow-up of these children to determine if baseline NNRTI resistance is associated with worse long-term outcomes. I would like to acknowledge my collaborators at Northwestern University, Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago, Seattle Children's Hospital, University of Bamako, Hôpital Gabriel Touré in Bamako, and Hôpital Universitaire Pitié-Salpêtrière in Paris for their work on this project. And most importantly, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the infants, children, mothers, and caregivers who participated in this study. Thank you.